Dennis now. Dennis, you work for the Social Planning Council, and there's something called the Community Data Consortium that I'd like you to talk about a little bit, because I found it really interesting.
Okay, let me start with that, and then I'm going to follow up on the points that have just been raised. First of all, the Data Consortium is something that we've been managing for almost 20 years, and it's 15 organizations that collaborate to buy census data, to buy Stats Canada data, and the Canadian Central Policy Alternatives, the Health Policy Institute, about 5 departments of government. We're all in this together, and we collaborate. And not only do we, cut the cost of buying data, because it is expensive, but we also collaborate on the definitions of the data we want, and it's neighborhood information on social information that we all need as part of our work. And the thing that I think that it's important to mention here is twofold, that I'll use this data consortium as an example.
Sure.
One is that what brings us together isn't just the data. We can probably access a lot of this other data, but what brings us together is a common interest in social development. And it's the human element that's the important, I think, factor when we're gathering data. A lot of you know about the government's cut on the long-form census and what that's meant. Well, this consortium, because we're working together, and we work with similar organizations and municipalities all across Canada through the Canadian Council for Social Development, what we've been doing is two things, is trying to find alternative modeling that will give us somewhat the same kind of perspective on social demographics. And so we're trying to compensate for not having that long-form data. But again, our motivation is looking at the kind of information that we need for health policy planning, for social development planning, and that kind of thing. And I think it's really important to remember that. You used Thomas Kuhn and the book, The Scientific Revolution, book of the 1960s. Well, if I can just point out that around the same time, there was a guy named George Hamans who was writing about sociology at the time. And he wrote an article that was revolutionary. He suggested that sociologists should put people back into sociology. And I think that, in a way, here, if we get too embedded in the technology, we forget that it's really important for social change. And not just general change, but change that actually improves our capacity as a society to meet our needs. And let's be honest, two things I think have to be said. One is, democracy doesn't always meet the needs of all populations in a country. It meets the majority, but not the interests of minorities or people who are disenfranchised. And technology can do the same thing. It can become a special interest when a lot of people don't have access to technology, or even when you summarize it the way you've done with Citizen Bridge, even then it's still onerous, and how do you navigate that when you don't understand the governmental system and that. So there's still barriers to overcome in terms of using the information. The other thing related to that, and I can elaborate on some of the things, and I think Mary Agnes will relate to this. A number of years ago there was a debate in journalism about journalists being objective. And I think that debate ended up by a recognition that you can't be objective. In our society, with the polarization, with the dynamics, with the different social contradictions of our society, that journalists had to recognize that they were not going to take sides, but you had to recognize that you're a part of that political dimension. And I think the same thing with technology. It can be used or misused and abused. And I'll give you a specific example. Right now, governments debate over how to measure poverty. What standard do you set when you're measuring poverty? So one government will use the market basket measure, and that's a fairly low measure. Some social agencies will use the low income cutoff, so that's the LICO. We use something called the low income measure, which includes a lot more information that people need to survive. Now that's political, because governments want to pretend that they're meeting the needs of people, so they'll use one measurement. So they can get the data. They get the same. We all get the same data, but then they will use their standard to measure how much need there is in society, whereas social advocates will use a different measure. And so the information is not objective. The information is going to be used differently for different political purposes. And I think that that kind of leads into what you're saying in terms of who uses the information and who's the gatekeeper to decide how it's used. And at some point, I think there has to be that relationship between those of you who are the techies and interested in open data, linking with the social advocates, the social analysts, the media people that help disseminate the analysis and commentary as well as the data. So there's a lot to that, but I think there has to be that integration to really put this to work in an effective way for our country.